What's happening in Gaza is a perfect example of the prison of the past. So let's stipulate that the events of October 7th were horrific and inexcusable. And let's stipulate that what is happening today is horrific. And challenge that I saw when I was president and grappling with these issues and dealing with some of the same players that are still on the stage now is the incapacity to absorb, or at least the willingness to willfully ignore the past. That's a problem, right? So not just the Palestinians, but also folks outside of the conflict oftentimes will efface or erase or ignore the very real history that led the Jewish people to insist on a homeland of their own because of their historic vulnerabilities that resulted in Europe in the systematic slaughter of millions. And if you don't acknowledge that story, if you don't acknowledge that truth, then it is difficult for the Jewish people or Israelis to listen, because that's such a profound truth for them. And what is also true is when Israelis refuse to acknowledge that Palestinians were displaced from their lands, often violently, and that what has occurred since then has been an occupation that creates a second-class citizenship, or not citizenship at all, but a no man's land, and that would be intolerable for most people, all people of any sorts, and that they have a justified reason to be angry and frustrated. That, if you can't acknowledge that, then Palestinians can't listen. And so the starting point is to acknowledge history. And the reason I think so often it's difficult to hear the other person's history is because we have a tendency to insist on moral innocence. All of us. We think it's any acknowledgement that our motivations, our actions are anything less than 100% pure, that somehow will weaken our claims and put us in vulnerable positions, and so we refuse. And when you continue to refuse the truth and reality when your story whitewashes the past, eventually you lose touch with reality, and it puts you in a position where you are willing to dehumanize others and say that anything is justified to win. And I do not believe in that kind of whitewashing. And I think that it is important for us to acknowledge, those of us who are not direct parties to the violence, to say, right now, children can't starve. Right now, there's not a military rationale for continuing to pummel what is already rubble. Right now, it is unacceptable to ignore the human crisis that is happening inside of Gaza. And it is necessary for us to insist that both sides have to find a path in which a Palestinian state and autonomy exists side by side with a secure Israel. It may not be possible to do immediately, but when I hear either side somehow pretend as if, and by the way, it doesn't require any of us to suggest that there's some perfect symmetry between the two, because that's also a trap we fall into. Well, what about this, and what about that, and that's worse than that, and this. The starting point should be, how do we break the cycle? And that requires a certain level of courage, but it also requires an acknowledgement among all of us, whether it's the Troubles, whether it's racial conflict in America, or the deadly long-running tragedy in the Middle East. It requires each of us to look at it ourselves squarely and recognize that we have been part of this tragedy, that our actions are not always perfect or blameless. Just that much acknowledgement is the starting point to breaking the cycle. And unfortunately, oftentimes, the leadership, the politicians, they have a vested interest in maintaining the notion that it is simply us and them, and it's their fault, because that helps keep them in power. And it's a cynical game, and I watched it throughout my presidency, and I was not always popular in that region because I would call them on. I think it's fair to say that me and the Prime Minister of Israel, who's still there, we're not the best of friends. We did not always get along. And I have Hamas's vicious approach to trying to solve a problem that puts all their people at risk is the height of cynicism that I reject as well.